Thank you, Bill. My name is Barry, and I'm an alcoholic. You know, I want to welcome the newcomers. Happy birthday to the birthday people, and happy Mother's Day to the mothers. And, of course, it's always nice to share a pitch with Al he's, you know, when Al came up here, he came up here with another guy that's bigger than I am, if you can believe it. I mean, he's massive. And these two guys came up here, and you know in the big book where it talks about whirlwinds going through people's lives and leaving destruction in the past? Well, I'll tell you, that's what some of these guys from down south tried to do to our program here in Santa Maria. But for me, I learned a lot. It was, I don't know if it was a breath of fresh air or not, but there was something that happened about that time in my quest for sobriety that was meaningful. And one of the wonderful things to me about Alcoholics Anonymous are these guys that do have 10 or 15 years or 30 years. You know, they're the ones that went before us, just like it says in the book about the path, following this path. They're the ones that, the path that I have to follow. You know, just, I don't have very much sobriety, but these are the people I look to when I'm in trouble with my program, or I reach a plateau in my program, or I reach somewhere where the old idea says, well, what's the use? You know, things aren't getting any better. It's these fellows that have been around a while that I have to consult with, that I have to use. They're a part of my program. I got into this Alcoholics Anonymous right here in this room about 10 years ago. Now, I wish I could stand up here and say I'd been sober 10 years, but that's, as most of you know, is not the case. Right through that door, on a very cold and blustery fall day, I had been invited to leave my house, but yet again, and I packed my little AWOL bag, as we used to call it in the military, and I set out for what I had heard in Santa Maria at the time. There was a little hotel down here called the, I can't even remember the name of it, it's been so long, Frome Hotel. And Frome Hotel. That's not breaking anybody's anonymity. Somebody else knows. But anyway, the Frome Hotel had been rumored to me was a place for people that needed a quiet place to dry out. And I needed a quiet place to dry out. So I came down here, parked my car, carried my little bag into the lobby of the Frome Hotel, and was greeted by a young gentleman who said, I'd like to check in for a few days. And he looked at me and said, do you know what kind of a place this is? I says, well, it's been rumored that it's a nice, quiet little hotel. And he says, well, you look like you need to talk to one of the people here. So he ushered me into a back room, and there was a lovely lady there that allowed us they told me what the Frome Hotel was all about. However, they didn't have a room, and I didn't look bad enough to kick somebody else out to make a bed for me, but she had a suggestion. So she called after she heard a little bit of my tale of woe and how different things were and how bad I was and bad off and sort of thing. She knew somebody who had been on the program a while, called him up, and he brought me over to the 1600 Club. I'd been by here a little while, and I thought this was just some school for wayward people or something. The cars in the parking lot were a rather different variety. I can remember stopping by here, and I used to have trouble finding places to stash my empties. You know, I couldn't bring them home. So I visited a lot of dumpsters in quiet places on the way home at night. And I can remember coming by this little place with a parking lot, and it seemed as though there were a number of people that lived in the parking lot. I later on was to understand why, having spent several nights in the parking lot of the 1600 Club. But anyway, my introduction to Alcoholics Anonymous in Santa Maria came this way. Well, where did it start? How did I wind up getting in here? And this is part of my pitch that I've had to change. It seems that when I was first been sober a while and was asked to do this, I wound up still being drunk by the time the time was up. Bill would have his dollar out and it would be time to go home, and I was still drunk in my story. And I also had a sponsor that would sit back there and lick his chops and think of the wonderful days that we all had during our pleasant drinking. So I've learned, I hope, to cut that part of my story down and to get on with the business of how I was able to find sobriety and what's happened since then. I was born sober in a little town. It wasn't to last long. It wasn't to last long. And in a little town in Massachusetts, north of Boston. Some people tell me there's some of that heritage left in my accent. And I have a very loving family. My father and mother had been beaten around quite badly by the Depression as far as a place to live and beans on the table, but nevertheless, I was the oldest child, and I have a youngest sister, 3.5 years younger. But we had a very loving family. My father and mother didn't drink very much, occasionally on Christmas, that sort of thing. I was never introduced to alcohol around my family. We moved around quite a bit. Dad was working his way out of the Depression years and the bankruptcies and what have you, and he made considerable sacrifices, I know today, in his life to give my sister and I a fair shake at a better life. I think that's one of the tributes to this country we live in, that our parents seek and try to help our children have a better life than we were able to have. And I was able to go to into a very fine school system, and my drinking started, I suppose, in junior high school, somewhere along that line. But I've had occasion lately to reread part of Chuck C's book, Through a New Pair of Glasses. And one of the things I identified very early, before the first drink came, was that I felt a part of you as a community. I never felt like I belonged to the kids in the neighborhood that I grew up with. I never felt that I belonged to the kids in the classroom that I was to go through grade school and on into high school with. This was a small town. There were only 62 people in my senior class. I always had that apart feeling. Now, I can remember vividly that when I started to drink at an early age, that feeling of apartness went away, and I was able to be a member of, be a part of. I was able to talk to people comfortably. Particularly the women. I didn't know how to handle women. Still don't, as a matter of fact. At least my Al-Anon's not here tonight, so I get away from. I can avoid that tonight. But this feeling of apartness, I can remember early in the drinking, made me feel part of. I was able to mix it up. I was able to be one of, and feel like that anyway. Well, during my high school years, I had a mediocre career as a football player, and I can remember being absolutely terrified on Friday night. We played all of our football games on Saturday mornings or Saturday afternoons, and Friday night was a no-sleep night with the old gut churning around and everything else. I don't know what I was afraid of or just what the heck was going on with me in those years, but it was a terrifying experience, and I couldn't wait for the game to be over until we could get at it, get with it, and party. This little town that I grew up in was next to a rather large city, and of course, being of a young, tender age in the state of Massachusetts, one didn't go down to the local bar. So we would traverse across the bridge on the Forest River and go over to the next city and drink in lovely places called, like, the Green Lantern and Tony's and wonderful places with little back rooms left over from the days of Prohibition, I suppose, and had been speakeasies. Many years later, I found out that the guys over in that town would come across the Forest River and drink in our local taverns called Matty's Sail Loft and McGurty's and what have you in my little town. And the cops used to sit on the highlands on both sides of this river with the bridge across it and count those of us coming home all right and them going the other way. And then they'd radio each other and say, hey, the boys are all accounted for. Let's go to bed. But anyway, it was fun, you know. I went on to college, and right at the end of the war, 1946, and during the war years, I was just a little too young to get into World War II, but I had an obsession with airplanes and pilots and all that part of the war effort. And when I went off to college, I was attracted to a group of young men who had recently been retired or discharged from the Army Air Corps. They were a member of a fraternity that in mass, when World War II had broken out, they'd gone down and gotten into the Army Air Corps, and almost all of them were pilots, navigators, or bombardiers. And I was fortunate enough to be able to become a member of that fraternity. I was the first non-veteran, I guess it was, to be so blessed. But these guys were great. I mean, they were 4 or 5 years older than I was. They had been to places like London and all over the world. They knew all about wine, women, and song, and poker, and what have you. And I was a willing learner. And it was absolutely great. And I lived with those guys in that fraternity house and partied and what have you. Now, as far as the drinking was concerned, I found out early in my drinking that if one drank too much, one got sick, and you missed the party, and you woke up and you didn't feel very good, and you threw up, and in your car, and in your bed, and what have you. So I figured that wasn't the way to do it, and I didn't want that to be interfering with what I had felt that alcohol did for me. So I set out on a quest to learn how to drink like a gentleman. Never drink too much to get sick and miss the fun and have to wake up and pay the penalty the next morning. And I studied very astutely, very conscientiously under this group of fraternity brothers of mine, and wound up being, you know, this was the way I lived my life for a great many years. I was able to not be obsessed with alcohol to the point where I abused it. I didn't like losing my faculties. Of course, I did learn to drive home with one eye closed once in a while, so the cat's eyes didn't double up, but that was seldom. And once in a while I would get drunk, and I would wake up with a hangover and be sick, and I didn't like it. And I'd back off for a while and say, hey, wait a minute, you know, you go down this road very far and you're liable to become an alcoholic. Well, this went on for a long time. As I said, I just missed World War II, and in 1950, another war broke out, and my name must have been on the top of that little capsule in the fishbowl they used to pick out when they draft people. And the war had only started, I think, on the 28th of August, and on the 1st of September I had a draft notice to report immediately and to be inducted into the Army. Well, I went home. I'd been working for the summer, and I was wondering how I was going to get money enough to pay my tuition and room and board for a while, because that summer had been taken up with a lot of partying, and I hadn't managed to save very much money. And I went home to my apartment that I shared with three other fraternity brothers and friends of mine in Boston, and all three of them had been recalled to active duty. And I mean, I went in the midst of a party about, no way am I going to do this again. One of my roommates had just finished medical school and had been recalled to go as a pilot. He notified them he was now no longer a pilot, but he was a doctor, and they recalled him as a flight surgeon. So we took his car home and left it with his wife and kids. I drove him down to a place on Cape Cod where he was to report for active duty, suggested that I would like to learn how to fly airplanes, and his first official act as a flight surgeon was to stamp me qualified for flying. And I had been into certain difficulties in the course of my life growing up, some skiing accidents and a few other things, and my eyes weren't quite up to what they would have if they'd looked at me closely, and a few other things. But anyway, that led to the opportunity of going into the Air Force and becoming a pilot in the Air Force. And that was so much fun that, it was a challenge. It was great. And again, people that wouldn't have gotten through that program successfully if I'd been caught abusing alcohol. So I was very careful in how I behaved and how I partied. And in due time, I graduated from pilot training. I got my commission, my wings, and my wife all on the same day. Now, I still have my wings, although I don't use them, and I still have my commission, but I'm retired, and I still have the same wife. That's the Al-Anon I talked about. So the government was good enough to ask me where I wanted to go as a second lieutenant, and I said, career, of course, and they obliged. And then they said, where do you want to go? And I said, well, we'd like to take our honeymoon in England. So they obliged again, and we went to England for 3 years and lived it up with the RAF. And if anybody's here that lived with the RAF, those people are professionals, not only as aviators, but they're professional partiers. And I was introduced to all sorts of things with my duty with the RAF. And, well, when it came time to fish or cut bait as far as being a career in the military, I decided to stay in the military rather than go back and chase ambulances. I'd been in law school when I was drafted. And I can remember dealing with this, the way my father had taught me how to deal with things. When you reach a decision-making time, you sit down and you write down all of the pluses on one side of the paper and the minuses on the other side of the paper. Or in the case of my fourth step, it was all the minuses over here and a little corner down here for the pluses. But I did this and decided that I would stay in the Air Force as a career officer. And I also remember distinctly deciding that I didn't want to pay the penalty of changing my lifestyle back to being a student, wondering where the next buck was coming from and where the beans on the table were coming from. And I can also remember there were certain other pluses that I wrote down. In fact, the availability of alcohol. Cheap, you know, $1.25 for a 40-pounder of scotch, you know, and by this time I'd become a Johnny Walker Red drinker. And I also liked the party. I liked the hard work. I loved the flying. I liked the hard work, but then there was hard play. I also, in looking back and doing my inventory, can realize that I was fitting myself into a place where I was comfortable. With a combination of hard work, of doing something I really liked to do, and having a lot of partying around when it was time to party, I was comfortable. I didn't have that feeling of not belonging anymore. It was partly relieved, as it has been earlier, on account of the booze. But the Air Force is a very fraternal organization, especially in the flying game. You get to know people, and you live very close to people, and it's a very compact community. Well, I had learned my lesson fairly well, and I didn't get drunk too often. There were occasions when things were rough, and I had been out working terribly hard for 3 or 4 weeks and celebrated by using a little bit too much alcohol, but it was very seldom. Didn't work that way very often. And my career went on that way. I wasn't aware of, well, we wound up staying in that tour lasted 6 years, 3 years in England and 3 years in Germany. And in Germany, by that time I had enough flying time. I was in a pretty good outfit, and we would be in Paris one night, and Rome the next night, and Athens the next night, Beirut, you know. It was kind of a fun outfit. And I can remember one of the first times that the glimmer of perhaps I was doing things a little bit wrong was we used to overfly. We had a trip every week that went down from Frankfurt down to Beirut. And we'd stay a day in Beirut and come back. And we'd stop in Athens in Greece to refuel. And we'd see the sun was always shining there in the afternoon, and we'd see the ruins of the Acropolis and all of these things. And I said, you know, someday the airplane's going to break so we can stay and see these things. Well, one day it did. So the other pilot and I got in a cab, and we went into a hotel in town. And you know those black bags that pilots carry? You see them always carrying the black bags around the airport? Well, our black bags had a little section in there. The guy that made them over in Frankfurt would ask you what you drank, and he'd make a compartment. So my bag was always tailored for my bottle of Johnny Walker Red. We'd get in the hotel room and have a snort and go about whatever excitement the rest of the day held. But we were going to be there a couple of days, and for the first time, I didn't do what I should have done, is gone out and look at the Acropolis and all the other ruins, and the chance of a lifetime. You know, I'd waited all my life to get to see Athens. I saw the Acropolis from the balcony of the hotel room between drinks. Whenever I was able to get out to the hotel room, and we stayed in that hotel room for a couple of days and got drunk. When it came time to left, bought postcards and guidebooks so I could read up on it and tell my wife what a wonderful place Athens was. And I didn't feel good about that. I felt as though I'd missed something. And alcohol was a problem in my life. And I remember the guy that I went on that trip with, he says, boy, he says, I'm going to switch to beer. He says, that was a rough trip. He did, and I guess he stayed on beer for about a month. But that was an indication. There were other indications that would have come along. As I progressed in the military, there was less of the flying that I enjoyed and more of the paperwork. And I'd get so fed up with the paperwork, I was ready to tear the place apart, and I'd have to go fly, get back to the old routine of living it up and on the road and flying. And beginning that seesaw thing you hear so many of us drunks talk about hard work and hard drinking, and eventually the booze begins to take over more and more of your life. And in my life, I began to recognize I was making decisions. Some of the decisions I made were just like that decision I'd made to stay in the Air Force. I didn't want my lifestyle to be interfered with. I enjoyed going home and drinking martinis before dinner. I enjoyed having a little cognac after dinner. And, and I enjoyed having a few days off to really let it hang out once in a while. I mean, it was great to go to the Washington Redskins games and have to ask somebody what the final score was. In those days, Sonny Jurgensen used to lose the game in the last 5 minutes. So they'd be comfortably ahead, and I'd have a couple more drinks, and then they'd wind up losing the game. But that was kind of how it went. As time went on, again, I passed up opportunities for advancement, jobs that would have enhanced my career, because I was afraid my lifestyle might be changed. I can tell you frankly today, I was afraid somebody would catch up with me, find out how much I drank, and how incapacitated I was becoming when I went to work in the morning, and how I had to have a drink or two at noon when things were really rough, and how I had to have a couple of shots before I stood up before a briefing, to give a briefing before a lot of senior people. And I was afraid that would happen. I had a chance to, about the time this was getting a little frisky, I went to Vietnam, and I had a great deal of training for a specific job, and when I got over there I found out it was ridiculous, you know. Nobody knew what I did. I had an office, I had a secretary, I had a safe. Nobody had the combination of the safe but me. I had an open travel order. If I decided, well, I'm tired of Saigon, let's go to Bangkok. The secretary called up and I went to Bangkok. If I got tired of that, I went to Taipei. I didn't have a job. Nobody was interested in what I was doing. And I opened that safe up, for my predecessor had left about 10 days before I got there, and I opened the safe up and there was a note in there and some empty bottles and a couple of trip reports. And he says, have a good time. So, of course, I had a good time. Well, I'd been off on duty with the State Department for a while, and I learned about how those people operate. They don't do anything in the office. Everything is done on the cocktail circuit or the lunch circuit, the 2 or 3 martini circuit. And there's nothing wrong with that. The rest of the world does it. But I learned how to do that there. And in Saigon, even if I was there, the office, the lunch hour depended upon what rank you had. The lower ranks had 10 minutes, and the higher ranks had 2 hours. And a lot can happen in 2 hours, because that was physical education time, you know. You went back to my hotel, and because of the prevalence of malaria in Southeast Asia, had to have a little tonic water and vodka as medicine for the malaria, and do a little exercising and have a little light lunch and a nap. And I got into that routine. When I came home from Saigon, there were some other things that happened that caused me to reflect that I was indeed in the grips of something to do with excess drinking. I had my first bout with Valium. I went in to see one of the doctors over there, kind of shaking. The hours weren't very conducive. It was 7 to 7, 7 days a week. And in the kind of a job that I didn't have, I occasionally had to travel, and I was there was not much going on. About halfway into this tour, I was kind of shaky, a little nervous, you know. And I went in to see a doctor, and he says, oh, yeah, well, how much longer do you have on your tour? And I said, about 6 months. And he gave me a bag full of Valium about this big to last me for 6 months. And I went home. I didn't know what it was. And I went home, had a few drinks, had the prescribed amount of Valium, and proceeded to have my first introduction to hallucinations and DTs. And I woke up, I didn't sleep. I got up the next morning and said, my God, I'm really in bad shape. I'm losing my marbles. Must be these pills. So I went back over to see the doctor, and there was another doctor there. And he says, well, we just gave you half a dose because we thought, you work up to this. And I had only taken the prescribed whatever they were. And I had this terrific reaction. And he says, this will calm you down. Your system will get used to it. So I went back and thinking, wait a minute, So the hotel I lived in was full of a lot of doctors and nurses and everything. And I ran into one of the old Army nurses, one of those old lieutenant colonels, Army nurses that's been around since the War of 1812. And she told me, this Valium is rough stuff. Didn't they tell you got to quit drinking? You got to cut way down on your booze if you're going to take any Valium. So I went into my room and took that great big, probably worth something these days, jug of Valium and dumped them down the toilet. Hell with this, I backed off on the booze, cut down on my drinking, and 2 or 3 days later I was all right. That was my first indication of what Valium would do to me. The first time I had hallucinations, the first time I had some DTs. Well, I'd already been to the hospital once with some morning bleeding, and that the doctor said, well, your system's upset a little bit, and cut back on your drinking. And that doctor said particularly the grape you want to avoid the grape. And I loved cognac. God, when you can buy a bottle of 5-star Napoleon for $1.50, you know. And so I cut back on the grape, and also found out that Scotch and Perrier I could drink pretty much all I wanted to and never get too drunk and never have any stomach problems. Well, that brings me up to where things got a little rough. Came back from Vietnam, went to Germany, and with the vowed idea of cleaning up my act, cutting down and drinking. And I did for a while. I had a beautiful job over there. I had people in Madrid and Ankara, Turkey, and I had to go and visit them and all that sort of stuff. But I was very careful to never drank, didn't drink at noon, quit drinking in the morning, and really cut down. But I wasn't very happy. People that knew me in those days, you know, they'd seen a change, and they blamed it on Vietnam. You know, I was burned out. If you were over there in combat for a year, you'd burn out too. So I was adjusting by not drinking, and as the book tells us, I was irritable and I was miserable. But I was not drinking. I was making a big effort to cut down on my booze. During this period, into that tour a couple of years, and I had been on a real bad one. I'd been off with some of my German friends. I was working in an office, a joint office with Frenchmen and RAF guys and Germans and Canadians, and really a heck of a neat bunch of guys. And, you know, we went out and did most of our business over lunch, 2-hour lunch, a little beer, a little wine. But I tied one on at a party one night, and I was just absolutely, I wasn't rebounding anymore. And I had a hangover. It was a 2 or 3 day recovery program. And I can remember going in to shave one morning, and there, pasted to the mirror, was the 20 questions for Alcoholics Anonymous. You know, I whipped those down and stuffed them in my pocket. I looked down at shaving soap, and there was, "This is AA." Here's AA for you. I said, oh, God, who knows? And, of course, my wife had decided I was having a little problem with alcohol, and she talked to somebody and said, oh, don't you know about Alcoholics Anonymous? So she'd come across some AA literature and brought them to my attention. Well, that hangover was a bad one, and I found out there was a meeting down at an Anglo-American church not far from where I lived in Frankfurt. And they had a meeting on Monday night, so I drove over there, parking in the shadows across the street, of course. I remember it was a night with fresh snow, and it was crunchy snow. And I watched all these people going in, laughing and hugging, and how you been? And I said, God, I'm in the wrong place. Life was miserable. Sitting over there in the dark with a hangover. Well, after they all got in, it was in the basement of this parish house over there, and after they all got in with the windows open and smoke coming out, and all this laughing and joking and everything else, I crept across and looked in the foyer, and there was a rack outside with all this literature on it about Alcoholics Anonymous and this and that and big books and 12 and 12s on a table, and they were all inside and the door was closed, you know. So I listened and I said, this can't be right. You know, this is not the place for me. But I did take some of the offering of the literature there, and I did see the big book for the first time, and I didn't go in, needless to say. So I went out and suffered through that recovery. Well, that was my first, actually the first time I got anything at all about Alcoholics Anonymous. So the story skips now to where it's time. I didn't want to go back to the Pentagon, and my lifestyle was that I knew that would put me in the nut house if I went back there again. Been there twice, and you don't survive 3 times. And so I needed a quiet, comfortable place, and it was pretty obvious that my career was nearly at an end. And I was invited to go somewhere and quietly spend a couple of years until it was time to retire. And I chose Vandenberg. I'd been out here in the 60s and watched some of the early missiles, and my father was still alive in L.A., and my sister, her family lived down there. So Vandenberg seemed like a nice place to wind down and prepare myself for the advent of retirement. So I came back here and with a typical over-the-hill job. You know, here they were casting this great career person out to pasture here, which is something that always happens. You can only stay in the military 30 years whether you like it or not, unless Congress waves some holy water on your tour and the promotion board waves some stars up there. So I came out here and decided to get things ready to retire. But meanwhile, I had just this nothing job. You know, all of this experience I'd been building up overseas and all this sort of stuff, it didn't mean a hill of beans to these people, and I had some nothing jobs, and I wound up being on the combined federal campaign is where I met my good friend Jimmy G., who was my counterpart in the United Way, who incidentally introduced me to all the places around here, because I was brand new. But we were later to come together under other circumstances. However, things didn't get any better. And when they got ready to retire me, they got me in pretty good shape. And I'd been kicked around a little bit and had some accidents and run into some various things. And so when I got my physical and things, they recorded all of these things that had happened to me. The doctor says, well, do you have any other complaints? And I said, well, I've noticed that recently I've had some reoccurring gastrointestinal problems. Now, by now, I'm up to at least a quart a day of vodka. I mean, it took a few to get to work. It took a few at 10 o'clock to get ready to go to lunch. And by now, I'm not drinking in the bars. I'm doing my drinking privately. And, they might think I'm an alcoholic if I drink like that in a bar. So I wasn't going into bars. And I took a few more snorts to get home. And I'd hoped that jug would last until I could get to the earliest available liquor store in Orcutt. So obviously I was having some kind of a problem, but it wasn't alcoholism. It was just this pending retirement. And meanwhile, my father had died, and I hadn't had much success in sprinkling resumes around the intellectual community or anybody else's community. And so I was, if you had those problems, you'd be facing retirement at the age of 47, you'd drink too. So he prescribed the upper GI and the lower GI and everything else. And I remember the radiologist looking at me with these pictures, and a great big grin came across his face. And he says, did you ever swallow a bag of marbles when you were a kid? And my gallbladder was all full of these big rocks. And he says, this looks kind of bad. He says, I think we ought to take care of this immediately. Why don't you go home, pack a bag, and be here at 4 o'clock this afternoon, and by 6 o'clock tomorrow morning, we'll take care of this. So I came home, packed a bag, went out to base, 6 o'clock the next morning, out came the gallbladder. And I came out of the anesthesia and intensive care, and this doctor, who was not just any run-of-the-mill doctor, surgeon, he was a good friend of mine. We'd known each other our paths had crossed for 25 years or so. And fine surgeon. And he's looking worried. And my wife's standing there with tears running down her face. My 2 kids are standing out in the hallway looking in at me, laying on this bed in intensive care with blood going in one end and both ends, I guess. And, I said, what's the matter? And he says, well, we got the gallbladder out all right. He says, but I had your liver out and took a look at it. And he says, I have never seen a worse-looking liver on a living human being. This is a surgeon with 30-some-odd years of looking at livers, of cadavers and what have you, So I immediately took the pledge. I knew precisely. Now, I had had malaria several times and Gohars and some other diseases that obviously affected my liver, but there was no kidding. The ball game was over. So I took the pledge, lying right there. And he says, yes, you never can drink again. And I said, not even a little glass of wine with Thanksgiving time? No, not even any vinegar with your salad dressing. He didn't say anything about alcoholism or alcoholic. He just said, you can't drink anymore. So I walked out of that hospital. Well, he said, you may never even get out of this hospital. He says, your liver's so bad it may not process the anesthesia. But anyway, I pulled myself together, and I walked out of that hospital on a 30-day recovery leave before I was to retire. Raked some leaves and stayed sober. It wasn't too bad, I got used to that. And I was into this sobriety, quote, about a month. I got a call from the station manager down at Lufthansa in LAX. And he says, we have a consignment here for you. And he says, is this the right address? And I knew this guy. I'd known him in Germany. And he says, your buddies over in Germany have sent you some wine. So the next day, UPS arrived with 12 cases of my favorite wine from my favorite vintner on the Mosel River. Well, I hadn't had a drink in 30 days, and I felt great. And the blood tests and everything else that they'd given me at the base, they discharged me and separated me, retired me from the Air Force with as being in pretty good shape. So the first night, that pallet was sitting out in the garage with these 12 cases of wine on it. And the wife said, well, you haven't had a drink in a month, and you seem to be okay. Why don't we split a bottle of wine? So we split a bottle of wine. Nothing happened. The next night, we each had a bottle of wine. And the night after that, as I remember, I'm out in the garage at 3 o'clock in the morning, pulling the tin foil off, pulling the cork out, drinking the wine, filling it up with water, putting the cork in, putting the tin foil back on. Same way I used to do it in my wine cellar in Germany when I didn't want my wife to know how much she drank. And she'd say, go down and get some wine for these guests we've got coming. And I'd go down and say, Jesus, I wonder if this has got wine in it or water. Well, anyway. So, I don't know, somewhere 3 months after the operation, I was back in the hospital, intensive care, bleeding. And by this time, my surgeon friend, he'd also retired, and there was a young fellow there that, one of these wet behind the ears types, shaves once a month, surgeons. And not very happy. By now I'm retired, you know. I don't, just another retired somebody to take care of, you know. And none of this pilot stuff or anything else. So he says, well, I don't know where you're bleeding from. He says, I can cut you from here to here. He says, we can open you up and look. He says, but I think probably we'll just let you lie there and bleed and see if you stop. And he had no idea where it was coming from. He took a lot of x-rays and one thing and another, but that was, anyway, I did stop bleeding. I didn't bleed to death, obviously, but I think it was 3 pints worth of somebody else's blood to keep me alive. So, of course, I took the pledge again. And I went home, and I stayed dry, and I got drunk. And I can remember that drunk. I woke up that next morning, one morning after I'd been dry a little while, and I just had to drink, damn it. You're an alcoholic, you got to drink. And by that time, I'd been introduced to the 1600 Club, and I had been sitting here in the back room, intoxicated on several occasions. And Orcutt, which is my home group, they kept saying, dummies out there, they kept saying, coming back. If you want to drink, that's all right. That was the only place I had to go anyway, so I went there, came here. And but I woke up one morning and I had to drink. Simple as that. And by now I was physically in bad shape. The arthritis was getting to me, and I was beginning to try to work my way out of it by lifting weights and playing golf and everything. Damn it, I had to drink. And I went over to the liquor store and I bought some booze and went off on a periodic, drunk. 3 or 4 or 5 days, I don't know what the hell it was, but when I started, I couldn't stop. And that's one of the things I heard here. See, I wasn't there yet. I hadn't had that problem. I just drank till I got too sick to drink anymore because this gallbladder was missing or what have you. But anyway, I was beginning to find out what this word powerlessness means. In fact, when I'm speaking, I rather say I am Barry, my name is Barry, and I am powerless over alcohol. Because this lesson of powerlessness, it was easy for me to walk in here and say, I'm Barry and I'm an alcoholic. But it took 5.5 years for the lesson of powerlessness to sink in. And that's where I was at this time. Well, I got drunk, and I got sick, and I went to the hospital, and they're getting tired of me out there. And I got out, and I swore I got to have some help. I heard something about higher power and all of this sort of things and the steps, and I had a book. And so I went to my spiritual advisor. And he said, well, I think we can take care of that. And he says, we'll check you into the monastery down in Santa Barbara. So I packed my little bag, took my AA book, carefully folded with a white cover on the outside. And I went down and I begged them, and of course the good father had arranged for me to get into the monastery, and I made a pact with him that I wouldn't drink. At the time, if I drank, I'd out of the monastery. And my wife was glad to see me leave, and my kids were glad to see me leave, and I went down there and lived in that monastery. And I got up at 5 o'clock in the morning, and I did everything you do in a monastery. A little cell, a little bed, a little chair, a little table, and I wrote my first inventory, just as it said in the book. And I took it with one of the fifth with one of the brothers, who was also on the program. And I went to AA meetings at noon, and I went to AA meetings in the evening. And I know all about the meetings down in the Santa Barbara, Carpinteria, Goleta area, and in that area. I stayed sober. And I got my health back a little bit. And I thought, geez, after 3 months down here, I ought to be able to handle the outside world. So I came home. A month later, I was drunk. Absolutely drunk on my butt again. Back to the hospital. Now they don't want to see me at all out there. And they're writing across my record, chronic alcoholic, terminal alcoholic, in red pencil. Well, got a little bit more sobriety. By now I'm collecting chits, you see. Friday night, 30-day chits, 60-day chits, 90-day chits. I got a job. I got 6 months worth of sobriety and thought I was ready to have a job. So I applied for a job and I got it. and I was making more money than I was in my life. I had a brand new Oldsmobile, and traveling all over the southern part of California, high off the hog. The only trouble was, it got a little rough. I was only working 4 days a week, and it was great. And then the more I worked, the more work they gave me, and I had just absolutely going nuts, and I started drinking again. But I was getting honest enough. I had told the guy that I worked for that I was an alcoholic, and I was trying to recover in Alcoholics Anonymous. And I'd made a pact with him that if I drank, I would resign. I'd quit the job. So I was beginning to find out a little bit about honesty, and I got drunk, and I spent 3 days on a fire road somewhere up in the Lake Kachuma area. I don't know where the hell it was. I was coming home, and I walked into that last liquor store on the way up to the pass, San Marcos Pass. I'd suffered all the way from Oxnard without a drink, but I couldn't make it over San Marcos Pass. And I remember going in and saying, well, just a pint to get home. And I walked up to the place where the pints were, and I went right on over and grabbed a fifth. And I got halfway over to the cashier, and I said, hell, this isn't going to do it. Went back and bought another. And I thought, well, geez, this straight vodka is going to ruin me, so I bought a gallon of Mountain Red. And then I thought, well, I better have something to eat, so I bought some Twinkies and God knows what else. I mean, nuts. And I drank a half a quart of vodka going over the San Marcos Pass, pulled off in that place where the sun was going down. I looked out over the lake, and the black and white came along. He says, everything all right? Oh, yeah. But I thought, God, I better get off the road. So I went down there some place and pulled off the road and went way up in the back of the mountains, way in the hills someplace. How I ever got the car in there, I was worried about getting it out. If it rained, it would still be in there. But anyway, I went in there and I drank. And I drank until it was all gone. And then I went down and had a hell of a time, and I finally got home. But this was the pattern. I don't need to tell you any more about this. What was happening to me was I was having to find out what powerlessness was over alcohol. I was having to find out that the higher power that I thought I had come to terms with early in my life was not the higher power that was going to do anything for me. I'd been around here. I'd done 3 or 4 steps. I'd had a lot of people here in this room that every time I'd come back in, it was a hell of a thing, If any of you have ever gone out, it's easy to go out that door, but it gets harder to come back in. You let the gang down. And all these guys that have been helping you, and the guys that have been sponsoring you, and they take you out in that back room that they call it the briefing room. And God, I went through everybody in this club. I had a lot of sponsors. Some of the sponsors fired me because I got drunk. Some of them I fired because they didn't get me sober, But I was a sickie. So this went on and on, and I went out to see a shrink. And so I thought, I'm nuts. It isn't just alcohol. Any sane man could give up drinking. You know what? Willpower. Something's wrong with me. I'm mentally ill. And he wouldn't give me any pills, but he suggested I might be able to get into a recovery program up at Travis Air Force Base. And my higher power, again, was intervening in my life, and I was able to go up there for 30 days. And I got my health back. I found out I had a cancer scare in those days. And I found out that all this pain I'd had in my back and my knees and ankles left over probably from a bailout years ago, this arthritis that was bending me over, was probably I was allergic to aspirin. If for no other reason, I went up there to that hospital up there, I found that out. And I was able to get off of aspirin, and the arthritis has gone away, or at least enough of it so I can play golf and get around. But I didn't stay sober. I went up to that program, and I desperately wanted sobriety. God, I wanted to be sober. I couldn't understand why I couldn't get sober. I came back, and I think that lasted 3 months, and I got drunk again. And absolutely, by now I'm knowing exactly what they say in the book about being pitifully incomprehensible demoralization. That's where I was. I couldn't live without alcohol. There's no way I could live without alcohol when that obsession hit. I could stay sober. I could white knuckle it. I had people that sat up with me at night while I shook at home so I wouldn't have to take a drink. And but it didn't, eventually it would pass, but finally, the obsession would come back again. When that obsession would hit, who the hell are you going to call? I'm not going to call anybody. And anyway, it took me to that place that it says in the book of incomprehensible. Because remember, when you reach that place, the incomprehensible part is because you're not sober yet. So why you have to drink like that, drink to live, is incomprehensible to you before you're sober. Today, it's different for me. I understand what was happening to me. I know why I was, so it's comprehensible demoralization. Anyway, and I was beginning to get honest. Every time when I come in here, you'd read the 5th chapter. It would say rigorous honesty. And it was like somebody was goosing me with a poker, because I knew that I lacked the level of rigorous honesty. So I had to, focus in on that for a while. And I was beginning to get honest in terms of I quit hiding bottles in the car, I quit hiding bottles in the garage, and when it came time to drink, I'd put the keys on the table, and I'd walk to the liquor store and bring the bottle back and lock the door in my bedroom and turn on my stereo for my classical music and pile up the books that I wanted to read and get drunk. I was surrendering to the disease of alcoholism. I know today. I couldn't do anything else. Well, in the midst of the worst night of my life, in hallucinations, which I'd had before, and the DTs and the convulsions and what have you, I surrendered, apparently. I mean, it was all over. There's still some vodka there, and my wife tells me it was about a 7-day drunk. And, it was all over. It's God take me. I can't do it. There's nothing I can do myself. And so whatever's your will for me, let it be done. I can't do anything myself. And I went to sleep that night, and I slept rather soundly. And I woke up the next morning, and I knew something had changed. Something in my life had changed. I wasn't totally aware of it. I wasn't in very good condition. I think if they'd had me in the hospital, my so-called vital signs would not have been very good. But I managed to get up and get something in my stomach, I don't even know what, and called. I had run out of sponsors, and I had a list on my dresser during some moments of clarity or what have you, during this drunk I was on. I'd made up a list of people I was going to ask to be my sponsor, ones that hadn't already fired me or I hadn't already fired them. And way down at the bottom of that list was the one that, if all else failed, I'd asked to be my sponsor. So anyway, I woke up that morning, looked at that list, and called him, the one on the bottom of the list. And at some ungodly hour, he tells me, of Saturday morning, and if you knew him as well as I do, you knew you didn't disturb him at that hour of Saturday morning. But anyway, he put the coffee pot on, I went over, and I surrendered. I surrendered to my higher power the night before, and I surrendered to him that morning. And as soon as I quit shaking long enough, I wrote a real 4th step. And surprisingly enough, when I took the 5th step, that burden that I'd carried was lifted. And I haven't found it necessary to take a drink ever since then. Now, I take no credit for this. Absolutely no. I did everything I could to practice my disease of alcoholism to the very best of my ability. But along the way, somewhere, you people introduced me to this program of Alcoholics Anonymous. Somebody gave me a big book. A lot of people were willing to sit down and share their experience, strength, and hope with me. Somewhere, a lot of it must have rubbed off. A newer, more sound comprehension of the 2nd step of the higher power that I have today, which is still more is being revealed. It's just neat what happens. And when I got that far, I was able to turn it over. And for the most part today, I'm still able to make a decision on a daily basis when I get up in the morning to turn my will and my life over to God. So I did nothing to get me sober except show up in this outfit and try to listen, do the best I could, and as sick as I was, to find out how you people learn to live without alcohol. And a lot of you learned how to live in sobriety, happily, the way it says in the book, happy, joyous, and free. And all these trips in and out of this hall, every time I came back, some of you were still here. Not all of you. When I'd go back out on a drunk, there were people here that I've never seen again. But some of you people were still here every time I could muster the courage to come back. And for that I am eternally grateful. And that's some of the magic of this program that helps me keep sober today, because when I come to a meeting like this tonight, some of those people are still here. Some of those people are still here. And I want to be part of this. This Alcoholics Anonymous is my life. Very early in sobriety, I guess somebody thought maybe it was for real this time, and I had a chance to start doing some H&I work. And I can say this from my own experience. Anytime your program seems to be in a rut or seems to get a little stale, try a little H&I work. That'll jerk you up in a hurry, seeing those people confined to hospitals and confined to jails. And I was following the path of the people that have gone before me, the people that are still here, go before me. Today I'm not alone. Today I don't have that feeling of being apart. Sure, I get out of those crapheads that Al talks about, but I don't have to, that's okay today. Here's where I belong. This is where I fit in. This is where I belong. This is where my program is. This is everything I need in my life in terms of human relationships today I find in this program. I found out that I have no business, for example, sticking my head under the hood of a car other than to see maybe the wires are hooked up and there's water in the radiator. But whenever I run into any problem I've come into so far in sobriety, there are people here that can help me with it. Whatever problem I've come into. So I don't have to be alone anymore. I don't have to be alone anymore. Everything I need. My wife's not an alcoholic, she's an Al-Anon. But sometimes I need to talk to a sober woman, female member of Alcoholics Anonymous. And it's a very necessary thing. And I am grateful today that I have some women friends in this program that are sober members of this program, sober members of Alcoholics Anonymous that I can share some of these things with. So, for me, sobriety has been absolutely fantastic. My higher power hasn't put anything in my path. When I wake up in the morning, I use the first 3 steps and I add the second part of the 11th step to it. I pray only for the knowledge of His will for me and the power to carry that out. I turn my will over to Him and I say that simple prayer. Whatever has come up in my life so far has not really been a test. And whatever it is, I've learned how to stop. I've learned how to listen when I meditate. I've learned what meditation's all about. I was one of these guys who used to pick the phone up and talk to God, and as soon as I was finished talking, I'd hang it up. I never waited for Him to tell me. I never listened for Him to tell me what I was to do. See? So today I can stop. Today I got a program. There's nothing that I've gotten into in sobriety that I haven't been able to fit into the 12 steps. I try to take problems or situations in my life and put them through the 12 steps. Even go right down through the 12 steps with some kind of a situation in my life. I may not be able to do a lot about what the answer is. The serenity prayer tells me, I'm asking God for the serenity to accept. Because sometimes there aren't answers. In my old life, I had to have an answer. Boy, I had to have an answer right now, yes or no. No in between. It isn't like that with me today. So I stay close to the program. I try to learn from the people who have gone before me in the program. I try to do as the service prayer tells us to be available. I love the idea that all I have to do is stay sober, work my program, and be available to somebody else that may need help. And it's a pretty terrific way of life. And I'm internally grateful for this opportunity to speak here. I kind of feel like this is my home. These are my people. Thank you very much.